Welcome to Lunch and Learn, everybody. We're going to talk today about delta waves. A couple of years ago, we talked to a major amplifier manufacturer for EEG. It was an older one, and we had run his amplifier through our labs and found out that everything below 3 hertz was missing on his amplifier. And we asked him, well, why did you do that? And he said, well, to keep out all the noise at the low end of the EEG. And we said, well, that makes some sense, but usually that's around, half a hertz or a hertz. And he said, yeah, but he said, this makes it easier and more stable. We said, but you're missing delta. And he said, well, delta doesn't matter. It's mostly noise. We're really worried about theta. And both Sean and I were taken aback by that because he spoke with such authority and conviction as a manufacturer of EEG amplifiers. And so I think that's a good takeoff point. Some people might think still that delta may be of minimal interest or value, or maybe a small topic. Those of you who've been around me long enough know it's not, as far as I'm concerned. So let's explore delta, kind of talk about what it is and what it does, and we'll see how much importance it has. So for starters, the standard rap, if you go to most workshops and talk to people, and the thing people latch on to first is delta is all about sleep. Well, is it all about sleep? Well, we do know that delta normally occurs when alpha drops out and theta increases during sleep onset. So here we have an example. This is actually from an alpha theta session where the blue is the alpha and that drops down. And then as it drops down and crosses theta, the theta, which is dark blue, rises up. And then the delta sharply increases as well. That's a standard kind of shift into stage 1 sleep. Now, when you're doing alpha theta, that transforms sleep into something else. It's no longer sleep. It's like doing drugs with sleep, sleeping pills. It's no longer sleep. And Martin will be offering a workshop in about 10 days to enlighten you on all those details if you're interested. And he does a very good in-depth discussion about sleep and how it impacts everything and how important it is as a global measure of health. So delta is very valuable in giving us information about global health. And we'll dig deep into why. But it certainly is common for it to increase as we get into drowsiness, and it shows up on our training screens. And we don't want too much of this drowsiness if we're training with eyes open, but sometimes it's unavoidable because people get very sleepy during the day, particularly in the afternoon, because most people aren't sleeping enough. You need 8 hours of sleep. And when you sleep, the first of the many sleep cycles you go through, and there's about 5 of them, delta dominates that first cycle in particular. And you can see here's that awake going way down into stage 4. We call that deep delta sleep. And it takes about an hour or so to get down there, and another half hour maybe to get back up, 45 minutes. It varies from person to person. And then we go into our first REM stage. But this delta sleep is correlated with a physically restorative process. If we have too much alpha in our brainwave activity because of thyroid problems, depression, extreme chronic anxiety, that will give us alpha intrusion sleep, and we won't get down deep enough in delta for that restorative process to occur. So that's something to keep in mind. In terms of the spectral distribution, delta dominates the eyes open spectral distribution. Now, this was confusing to us in the 90s in neurofeedback because we had all these people drawing from neurology texts saying, well, there's no delta in the waking EEG. It's, it's eyes, that's not supposed to be there. But when you look at a fast Fourier spectral analysis, you'll see delta is the highest amplitude frequency in the eyes open EEG. And so here is an example of the EEG spectrum going from 0 to 25 cycles a second. And you can see delta is this first thing here, this first head here, and the eyes open. And you'll notice that it's red in the front. That means delta is highest in the frontal region, and that's what all the research shows us. And that was very counter to everything that we were kind of hearing about in the 90s. So there was a lot of confusion in the field of neurofeedback, as often is the case, because they weren't digging deep enough into the research. And hopefully we've overcome that problem over the last 20 years. So we're here to tell you that delta dominates the awake eyes open EEG. It's highest in the front. Good thing to know. But delta isn't just about sleep. High or low regional or diffuse eyes open delta can indicate sleep issues, but local or regional eyes closed delta also correlates with inflammation. Focal delta correlates with lesions or head trauma. And you can have lesions from head trauma. You can also have lesions from toxin exposure. You can have lesions from viral and bacterial and spirochete activity, and even prions, perhaps. Low power delta correlates with white matter loss, and that's something that a lot of people aren't aware of. So we're going to look at these different aspects of delta as we move along here through the discussion. One of the ways we can identify sleep problems is if we compare the eyes closed map to the eyes open. So here's an eyes closed map at the top. And you can see we've got a little bit of delta, but nothing diffuse or really just around the temporal regions, the ventral pathways. And the eyes open, notice how we get a really high burst of diffuse elevated delta. Also some elevated theta. Now that is not there in the eyes closed, which means that it's not due to anything that's a permanent organic condition. This delta is a reflection of a state change. And why is that state change occurring? Because this person's not getting enough sleep, and we don't get enough sleep. When we have our eyes open and we're training with neurofeedback or doing anything else, we have higher than normal delta, and often higher than normal theta too. So that's not uncommon to find that happening. That's something you want to look for when you're training people, but also in the mapping. And that's one of the reasons that the eyes closed map is more reliable than the eyes open map, because the eyes closed map often sidesteps these state changes when it comes to analyzing the brain and looking for organically based problems, neurogenically based problems. One of the things that we can see with eyes closed map that indicates a problem is a lot of heavy frontal delta. Now we have to be careful that that frontal delta isn't from involuntary eye saccades, which many people have. So when you're mapping people, you should be watching your raw EEG to make sure there's not steady delta going off and watching their eyelids to make sure it's not from eye movement back and forth or up and down. If it's not, and it's elevated like that, and it looks kind of like this when you're doing the map, there's a chance that you have what's called frontal intermittent rhythmic activity, or FIRDA. That often occurs when you're exposed to heavy metals, in particular mercury and lead, and they tend to elevate frontal delta. But also aluminum has a very similar metabolic pathway to mercury, and it can also, if it's in high enough quantity, increase frontal delta. You can see that on the maps of some of the kids in areas where there's a lot of aluminum in the water supply. Okay, the inflammation and degenerative disease is a common issue with delta, and in the case of Parkinson's, as we lose dopamine and we begin to develop an inflammatory process in the substantia nigra, that inflammatory process is killing off the dopamine. And that's why we're losing dopamine. And that inflammation spreads throughout the brain, and this is a typical map of somebody with the Parkinson's. One of the things you often see in Parkinson's is the theta is often higher than the delta as compared to something like dementia. And there's usually quite a bit of alpha and a loss of beta, because Parkinson's, its reduction in dopamine tends to reduce beta activity and to some degree alpha activity. We've had experiments where people were injected with L-DOPA, and it tends to increase beta and alpha activity. So we know it has a strong impact on those frequencies. So in Parkinson's, you tend to see more theta. Now, the Parkinson's occurs apparently because the latest research is telling us that inflammation in the gut is migrating up the vagal nerve pathway and into the substantia nigra. So that's one way it gets in the back door of the brain. So there's inflammation in a degenerative disease. So in Parkinson's, we'll see a lot of elevated delta. We've got other maps of Parkinson's we'll show you later. Focal lesions and Lyme disease is another thing that generates delta. You'll find people with Lyme, once it's initially pretty developed, you'll see lots of spots and sometimes regions of elevated delta. So it tends to be more spotty and regional. And you can see here, F3, F4, T3, T4 are quite yellow, but C3, C4 aren't. So it's spotty and regional. And you can see here the lesion site here on the right side. From this is from Lyme here. So this is a lesion from Lyme. So that can show up as elevated delta. So that's an organic issue. Head trauma is another one that shows up as elevated delta. So here we have somebody who's had a serious head trauma. Notice diffuse elevated delta. Head trauma can be focal, regional, or diffuse. And drugs can be diffuse too. So if a drug is having a very strong effect, if you have a lot of opioids and you're really getting drowsy, you'll get a lot of diffuse delta, but that won't be from the direct action of the opioid. That affects alpha more. It's an indirect effect of drowsiness. Head trauma, we get diffuse elevated delta and often diffuse elevated theta because there's a lack of perfusion both in the white and the gray matter in head trauma. Often that kind of starves the neurons and they kind of go into hibernation. That generates a lot of diffuse global theta. Now, the delta that's occurring from the head trauma is coming from axonal shearing, and you can see an axon here, and how the axon gets twisted and torn, and there you have a torn axon. It may not be completely torn. It may just shear some of the white matter, get a highly varied effect. So on the brain map, the delta may be high, it may be regional, it may be more focal. It tends to be more focal, and particularly in the temporal lobes and the frontal lobes, usually. But sometimes, if it's bad enough, it can be more regional. And that's why we get such bizarre effects from head trauma. People having strange visual images, feelings of electricity moving through their body, hearing buzzing sounds, just an endless variety of peculiar sensations coming from head trauma because of this partial shearing of the axons. That also reduces conduction velocity, slows down processing. Another thing that causes elevated delta is substance abuse. And so Alper et al. Back in the 90s, along with Leroy John, looked at meth addicts because they found that a lot of these guys looked like they had lower than normal delta. They didn't know what lower normal delta meant. They wanted to find out. So they looked at these guys and they found that indeed they had very low delta. This is the old NX-Link database, and you can see absolute powers like magnitude in R's. And white means extremely low, more than 3 standard deviations below normal on delta. This is a composite of a bunch of addicts, and they looked at 17 crack cocaine dependent adults. When they investigated why their delta was so low, they found it was because of white matter loss. So when you have shearing from a TBI, initially you may have high delta, but if enough white matter loss occurs, you're going to start seeing low delta. And that was one of the problems with the early and still present discriminants for head trauma. A lot of the discriminants miss head trauma because they're looking for a pattern of high delta. And older head traumas often have a pattern of low delta. And so the discriminants won't capture that. So be wary. I wouldn't give a discriminant with a map that had low delta. You're probably not going to get very good information. Okay, what are the main functions of delta? Well, we know that stimulus orientation is one. That's Knyazov talks about that. And that involves your attention system looking out into the world and having your attention system being captured by something that's viscerally important to you. It's emotionally, like some good food. If there's food that you crave, like sugary foods because you have Candida, and your Candida is stimulating your vagal pathways. When your eye fields capture something sweet, that'll shift your attention over because those Candida want to get fed more sugar so they can multiply in your gut, create inflammation, and make your life miserable. So stimulus orientation is a big one. Memory consolidation, that was researched in the 70s and 80s and 90s. They were noting that it looked like theta was involved a lot with memory consolidation, but in more recent times they found that delta is too. So delta is involved as much as theta with memory processing. And in fact, those little waves that are in low beta, which we call sometimes sensory motor rhythm, but when you're falling asleep, sleep spindles, those sleep spindle waves combine with delta to provide memory consolidation activity during REM sleep. And there's some good discussions on that, like this one, Dreaming and Offline Memory Consolidation from 2014, a really good article on that topic. Now, we run into a lot of false delta when we're mapping, and that's where the headache is, and that's what that engineer was trying to get rid of. So he had good intentions, but wasn't really well educated on electrophysiology, and this happens a lot in our field. It's often driven by engineers who don't know a lot about electrophysiology. Fortunately, we have people like Tom Kalura, who knows a lot about both, Robert Thatcher to some degree, and a few others. And that's why we build software the way we do and talk about things we do, because it's easy to capture false theta and false delta and think you're getting something out of it or doing something that's not happening or seeing something that's not there. Now here's eye blinks. You can see this is roughly a 1 second period here where this triplet of eye blinks is. That would show up as delta in your EEG. Now if that just occurred once or twice, it would wash out in the averages, but it was happening a lot, you would get false delta in the eyes open map, and that's something that we have to guard against. So when you see a lot of frontal delta, you want to check and see what was there eye movement or eye blink, or do we have something like FIRDA? So if you're not seeing clear artifact, then something's going on. That's the rule of thumb. The delta artifacts can come from a poor ground connection, from ear clip movement, ear clip banging against a high collar, cardioballistic from heartbeat, toe tapping is the most subtle one, eye saccades, eye blinks, sweat or hot flashes can cause false delta, poor ground impedance, and amplifier saturation. usually comes from moving around too much. So those are all things that can cause false delta. We have to protect against that. When we're doing brain mapping, we usually rule these things out just by doing good procedures on setting up the cap. But you still have to watch out for toe tapping and eye movement. And there's a whole video on this, on artifacts and delta and other artifacts, up on the NewMind YouTube channel if you want to know more about this in more depth. Managing artifact during training can be a problem. Here you can see this black is the delta. It's getting higher and higher, and it's going up and down a lot. That's rarely due to brain activity and drowsiness. Delta tends to go up more gently with drowsiness. Here we're getting probably a lot of movement. We can see a lot of movement in theta down here too. That's at the same time as this delta. And then we see a lot of yellow here, which means that person is very tense. They're clenching their jaw, probably. So we're getting a lot of movement there. Now our software tends to remove most of the artifact, but it's impossible to get rid of all of it. It still affects your averages and what's going on to some degree. But of course we want to get out as much out of our training as we can. If you see a more gentle trend of delta, that means your client's getting drowsy. You might want to talk to him for a second. You might want to recommend that they don't stay up late at night and watch the blue screen. You might want to recommend that they spool down, as Martin says, before they go to bed, that they have good sleep hygiene, that they don't come into your office in the afternoon ready to fall asleep just because they're sitting in a chair. Here's a heavy metal case. This one was presented by Rob at one point. It's a very interesting case. He even had hair analysis to show all the heavy metals. And this was coming out of their drinking water, as I recall. And there was some fracking going on nearby. And I think this was cadmium or something similar to that. Some wonderful heavy metal getting in there. But you can see it had a diffuse effect, not just frontal, but diffuse. So sometimes if you're getting enough of it, it's not just in the front, it's diffuse.
That was a young boy, Richard. It took me a while to get online. I'm having problems today with online stuff, but that was a young boy, and he had history of head injury, birth trauma, and all the heavy metal stuff going on there as well.
So that's why it's diffuse, right? Okay.
Yeah, and I think the mother used aluminum cookware and aluminum foil, and that's one of the reasons his aluminum was so high.
Yeah, we want to stay away from that aluminum as much as we can. It is very toxic for us, particularly our brains. Here's Lyme disease. We had showed you this one earlier, and you can get a better sense of the whole distribution. You can see how the delta frontally dominates, and this rest is all blue. This person was practically non-functional and in her 30s, early 30s. We just did neurofeedback, but she went after her diet. She made sure she was getting exercise. She was doing wall climbing for exercise, really getting into her diet, was working with a nutritionist. We eventually overcame the majority of her Lyme issues. I mean, she went back to school, she got married, she got a job, she had a nice place. She went back to functional with neurofeedback and good care. It's really amazing if you do a biopsychosocial approach, how profound you can move people, but you have to work on everything. Now here's somebody who chronically did not sleep and did not believe he needed sleep, and so he never slept more than 4 hours a night. And you can see how low that delta is. A lot of times you'll see people who are chronically sleep deprived. Rather than having high delta, they'll have low delta. And it's really interesting. It's probably related to acetylcholine activity, but we're not, clear on all the mechanisms. There's just not been enough research on that, but we know that people who have chronically little sleep have low delta. So this was a map that was taken after he got a couple of days sleep, And you can see this low delta is still there, but it's much better. Also, his slowed alpha is much better. He actually failed the TOVA on the left side, and he passed it on the right side. So that delta deficit can make you fail a TOVA as much as too much delta. And if you're not familiar with TOVA, TOVA is test of variables of attention. It's test of your ability to attend. It's a real-time computerized performance test, like our attention test, our NewMind attention test, and our computerized performance test. But ours is only 7 minutes long, and it's only meant to look at your ability to focus for 7 minutes. It's not the same as the TOVA exactly. Stroke often shows up as elevated delta. Here you can see the stroke on the left side. Here's the left side from the MRI. We reversed it so it matched the maps, and you can see massive loss of cortical area and even subcortical area from this stroke. And here you can see how high the delta is on the left side. And you can even see perfusion is diminished to how high the theta is as well. So a good example of stroke damage from that. Now there are other abnormal correlates of delta, which are classically from the literature. Low frequency delta problems, when it's really high amplitude, low frequency, can sometimes indicate a cortical disconnect from subcortical brain networks. Well, that would give you a real problem attending to stimuli, wouldn't it, since that's its job frontally. And we see that in kids who get labeled as ADHD, but they don't have any theta, they have too much delta. Elevated focal over areas of white matter indicate damage or inflammation, and that's Knyazov cites multiple studies showing that. Elevated frontal delta, dysfunction of thalamocortical connections, very much similar to what is in the first item there, but it often shows up in toxic or metabolic encephalopathies like too much lead, mercury, aluminum. Synchronous high amplitude temporal lobe delta, so delta bursts that are synchronous and occurring in the temporal lobes, like down here, can often be a consequence of decreasing blood sugar. So blood sugar instability tends to be isolated more in the temporal lobes than anywhere else. High amplitude delta correlates with low acetylcholine. So that's often why it's related to sleep deprivation. Low amplitude delta correlates with reduced dopamine. So we were talking about that low delta that we saw in Alper's study. Dopamine may be implicated in that, low dopamine. Diffuse frontal delta in toxic and metabolic disorders, well, we talked about that. Another thing that can cause delta variation is myelination, the growth of white matter, of fatty substance around the axons, which makes the axons conduct impulses faster. That's myelin. It tends to normalize between the ages of 8 to 10 years of age, which is why we expect people in the 8 to 10 year age to have 9 or 10 cycles a second alpha. If they don't, then they're not myelinating at the normal rate. But alpha frequency begins to decline after 60, although it's highly individualized. That's because we're starting to lose myelin. So when you see older people with slowed alpha, that may be an indicator of early demyelination. It's common once you get to be 55, 60 to start to lose a little myelin. A lot of it's due to the fact that inflammation is common at that age. Does it need to be that way? The people at Mayo Clinic and other places say no. The reason that we begin to develop so much inflammation in our 50s and 60s is because of our diet. It's too high in protein, and we've got all kinds of contaminants in it, and that tends to generate more inflammation. Plus, people develop inflammatory process that's chronic in the gut, and that leads to global inflammation degeneration as well. So things to keep in mind. So delta is telling us about all these things. White matter hyperintensities, we mentioned that in Lyme. Spirochetes tend to come out and play whenever the immune system gets low. In other words, whenever you're under stress, the spirochetes say, oh, the cat's away, the stress system's not working, let's come out and play. And they cause damage. It's like chemical warfare in the brain. And that damage affects the perivascular spaces, the spaces around arteries, that where fluid comes and goes through the brain, causes demyelination, reduced local blood flow, so you often see a lot of excess theta as well in a lot of issues that involve inflammation in delta. Pathological signs of oligodendritic apoptosis. Well, that's a mouthful. And my mouth is not used to those words because I'm not a physiologist and neurophysiologist, but what that means is that the supportive neurons in the brain, not the major neurons, but the supportive neurons, the glia cells, they start to die. But they don't die completely. They just sit there and hold space. And that helps reduce the seeding of cancer and the growth of cancer. So it's an important process, but that starts to show up. Damage to axonal projections, we talked about that, and interference with normal neuronal functions, the slowing of the impulses through the axons. So all of those things are related to white matter hyperintensities, and they show up as these little white spots. You can see them at each of these 4 areas here, and you can see little ones all dotted through the brain. That shows up all the time in Lyme, along with delta over those regions. Sources of white matter hyperintensities besides Lyme can be infections, autoimmune reactions. That would be if you had celiac or were highly sensitive to gluten, toxins, whether they're untested household chemicals, the glyphosate in your Roundup that you think is safe but is not, and other chemical agents that you're constantly using, which have never been tested, and there's tens of thousands of them. And they all get in your brain, along with plastic. Okay, so symptoms of white matter hyperintensities, well, I'm not going to go over these, but you can see they're pretty profound. So when you see delta spotting around the brain, if there's not been a head trauma, there might have been exposure to spirochetes, virus or bacteria. Could have exposure to some toxin that came and went, and this can cause all these symptoms. So delta is associated with all of these symptoms. I mean, they're quite a variety here. The primary source is in the frontal region with delta. As we noted early on, that's where it's highest. Key oscillation sources are from the insula, and if you recall, the insula is the area of the brain that connects the body with the emotional brain and then connects that with the cortex. It's one of the main interfaces in the temporal lobe region that communicates what's going on in the body to the brain. So delta is critical for that communication process. Martin was just mentioning before we got on that it's the oldest frequency because it goes back to the dinosaurs and the lizards. It's dominated their brain, which was mostly brainstem, and that is true. In fact, a very famous neurologist has proposed that that level of delta is where our basic conscious awareness comes from, and that all creatures have some degree of conscious awareness, and that delta carries that degree of conscious awareness. The book was by Antonio Damasio. It's called The Feeling of What Happens. Antonio Damasio, Feeling of What Happens, if you're interested in that kind of thing. Functionally, delta oscillations are part of the synchronization of brain activity with autonomic functions related to motivational processing, associated both with reward and defensive mechanisms, and in cognitive processing involving attention and the detection of salient stimuli. That's That's pretty lizard level, definitely. And that I even gave you the page source in case you're skeptical. You can go in Knyazov and read. If you don't have Knyazov, we kind of post him regularly. He's the go-to person for delta information. Diffuse delta and neuroinflammation. Niedermeyer, who's kind of the medical expert, who wrote the medical Bible on EEG, he tells us that inflammation and EEG are intimately related and related to all forms of pathogens and other problems. Knyazov says the lack of specificity of this effect prompts one to suggest that increase of slow waves or decrease of alpha are almost universal responses to any brain damage or pathology or even deviation from a homeostatic optimum. So the first line is just picking up from another paragraph we don't have. But what he's saying is that increasing alpha and decreasing delta are often common patterns we see in just all kinds of brain damage. Something to keep in mind. Here's some lead poisoning of a 10-year-old. So, I do a lot of mentoring and have in the past, and I collect these maps. And here's one. This was actually a child, 10-year-old, with lead poisoning. You can see there's the frontal FIRDA, intermittent delta, quite a bit of diffuse delta, and then you see frontally a lot of slowing, probably reduced perfusion as well. If you didn't know it was lead poisoning, it wasn't tested, he has ADHD, give him Ritalin. Let's not blood test him. Okay, so there's a clear picture of it, and you can see that the lead causes generalized slowing. Pretty interesting. So our excitotoxic model is what we have to think about in delta in the brain, and the latest research is telling us that oxidative stress, which can come from both physical things like toxins and physical damage, all the way to emotional distress. Severe emotional distress causes oxidative stress too. That leads to low ATP production. That's why you always hear me say, well, mitochondrial reduction when they can't produce beta. You can't run your sodium potassium pumps, get that high frequency activity because there's too much oxidative stress. That results in a chronic inflammatory response. We often see that first in alpha, and that means people are developing depression. And then if it goes on too long, it starts to show up in delta. So we developed this model, which I published, and we periodically post, of brain too fast, where there's a lot of excitotoxicity, creating heavy oxidative stress, brain stuck in the middle, where we're starting to develop an inflammatory response that usually results in depression. And if it goes on long enough, we end up with really a lot of delta inflammation and really slowed alpha and some deficits in perfusion. We call that the oxidative stress cycle in the brain. So you can actually see the pattern. If you're looking at brain maps from that perspective, they will make a lot more sense. But the end point is this elevated delta for brain too slow. The excitotoxicity from social distress, from distress at work, at home, in the family, that results in excess glutamate building up in the brain. Glutamate's an important neurotransmitter for activity. Actually, glutamine is the real important one, but glutamate is the byproduct. So glutamine gets converted to glutamate when it's metabolized. Then the astrocytes are supposed to convert it back to glutamine, but it doesn't happen because there's so much of it. It overwhelms the astrocytes, and glutamate's toxic. And then we have that apoptosis that we were talking about, inflammation, and that can give you white matter hyperintensities as well. And eventually it gets through all the interstitial tissue in the brain, and you get general inflammation. And then you see your delta. This has an effect on the mitochondria. Here we have our little mitochondria down here, and you can see that we're getting calcium here is sneaking in right there into the cell at high rates because of excitotoxicity. That's what the glutamate does to the glial cells. And then that calcium gets all inside the cell, and the mitochondria try to absorb it to protect the cell because that's their survival, that's their environment, that's their ecology. They start to become overwhelmed. They can't produce ATP, which is the energy source for running their sodium and potassium pumps, which are right here, voltage-dependent pumps. This is Martini et al. It's one of the best articles I've seen on this topic. It's old, but it's really clear. So this is what goes on with extreme social distress. Then we have global interstitial inflammatory process. Often that comes not just from excitotoxicity, but from inflammatory process in the gut, and it gets into all these areas of the body, a bone, lung, liver, everywhere. It starts with increased inflammation in the gut. We get elevated zonulin levels, which open up. They control the T junctions. Lipopolysaccharides leak out along with proteins that cause an autoimmune response and inflammation. And the lipopolysaccharides burden the liver, can cause it to go toxic. You start to lose thyroid T3, and then you see that elevated diffuse alpha with blue in the dominant frequency, slowed blue alpha. And then again, we're back to that problem. Once the thyroid T3 is diminished, ATP is again impacted. So it all comes back to the mitochondria who produce your electricity in your brain. You get sodium, potassium, pump activity reductions, increase slow alpha, and then slowly we build up increasing delta. And of course, we talked about that autoimmune response where the cytokines start to attack all of the organs of the body and the brain. This often comes from gluten and glyphosate. I think most of the studies these days are telling you stay away from any flour that's not organic. It's even contaminated if it's organic to some degree, but you're really bucking for inflammatory process and that whole cascade that I just talked about. Here's somebody who stopped taking gluten. There's your brain on gluten. This is the bottom one, your brain off gluten. Now, they did 15 sessions of neurofeedback and stopped taking gluten. You can see they got a 50% reduction here already. They stay off that gluten longer and do neurofeedback, massive changes in the brain. So gluten, because of the inflammatory process it creates, reduces the brain-blood barrier and allows the interstitial inflammation to get into the brain. We are now recognizing interstitial spaces like skin. It's another organ in the body. So changes in the gut microbiome communicate with serotonin pathways in the brain. The gut microbiota control host tryptophan metabolism along the quinolinic pathway. This pathway is stress and immune responsive. So not only does the gluten and the glyphosate cause these problems, the stress makes it worse. Most of the stress studies on animals, they died of gastrointestinal lesions. It wasn't from their food, it was from their stress. And this influences serotonin quinolinic acid production, and we've gone over this a lot before. You get a pro-inflammatory response. Tryptophan is converted to quinolinic acid instead of serotonin. Serotonin levels drop, and we become depressed. That's when we get that elevated alpha that starts to slow in the brain. Reduction of glutamate uptake, reduced glutamine output, lipid peroxidation, the cell structures in the glial cells break down, and the neurons too, and then apoptosis. And there's the pathway. If you want to really dig into it, you can see the tryptophan is going, instead of to hydroxytryptophan to serotonin, it's going down to kynurenine. I wish they would come up with easier words to pronounce, and then there's your quinolinic acid. Candida has a similar effect. If you're a big sugar eater, okay, it affects the small intestine and bacterial overgrowth, and produces compounds that also affect the production of dopamine, and Candida can get into the brain and cause inflammation as well once it gets into the interstitial tissue. That's a whole other topic. I'm not going to get into that too much. Localized activity in delta that appears in the cortex is usually directly over white matter and lesion. So when you see the elevated delta, you know there's a lesion underneath, or after a localized thalamic lesion, which can, as we saw earlier, produce frontal delta as well. The volume of the lesion is correlated with the delta power. So if we have more delta, we have more lesion activity. There's a TBI. You can see it's showing up mostly in relative power because this is low power. If we used our shift, we would get the same thing. In NuMind, we use a shift instead of relative power. And you can see that delta and theta is elevated. There's another picture of that TBI, slowed alpha dominant frequency with a really confused asymmetry. When we're interpreting local delta, people often ask me this: how do I look at local delta, like at F3 or T3, and make sense of that? And I've been telling people lately there's been an interest in it. If you see either high or low delta at any of these locations, just look at the chart, see what the function of that location is. That function is going to be affected because you're affecting conduction velocity of impulses, and you're affecting the quality of the connection to the cortex between cortical locations. So if an area has too much delta or too little, it's going to suffer functional problems. And the more delta there is, the more that's going to be the case. But the only way you can tell how much it's affected a functional problem, because of the complexity of the brain, is to do a computerized performance test and measure it. Head trauma can also produce neuroendocrine dysregulation, and that uses a very similar pattern to what we saw in Moritini before. But it also affects the NO pathways and compresses the pituitary and compresses the hypothyroid area of the brain, and that distorts neuroendocrine function, and you get all of these really high levels of problems, particularly endocrine problems, when you have TBI with neuroendocrine. Now, how would you know that was the case? It's if their symptoms don't go away after 6 months and they still have a lot of delta in spite of what you've all done, even if that delta is diminished and they still have the symptom intensity, then you're probably dealing with neuroendocrine dysregulation. In terms of training neurofeedback, we often see when we train delta down or theta down, everything else tends to come down too. That's the brain healing. It's not an error. It's okay if the theta goes too low, that's okay. If the beta goes too low, that's not a problem. That's the brain adjusting. It's one of the many cycles the brain will go through in the healing process. Brain's not linear, it goes in cycles, which drives us all crazy on the pre-post maps, but that's just the nature of the brain. We have to learn to deal with that. Here's training 2 to 7 down. This person had too much delta and theta. That would be protocol number 3, probably, or 4. And notice alpha came down, beta came down. They all went really low. That's often the case when you train delta down. Notice the theta normalized. This is all actually good. What you're going to see is slowly the alpha and beta will come back up as the brain's ability to produce energy returns as the inflammation reduces. Some more down training results. Here's a really nice one. Notice we got a lot more green left over in this down training. 35% change, good change. Still lots of the red down, lots of green. And of course the beta went down more than we expected. It'll come back up in due course. Here's a post-concussion map. Elevated delta from shearing. Now we see what happens. Reduced perfusion in theta, elevated theta, and then we have the increased inflammation. Perfusion and inflammation problems tend to go together, so we see delta and theta increasing often at the same time. Here's a brainstem trauma. What did that do? That caused serious problems in the oscillators in the brainstem, so that information is not getting up to the brain, and we have low delta in the back. The rest of the brain, you can often get brainstem trauma where the brain looks almost all completely green, except for the low delta. Severe insomnia. We showed you this before. Eyes closed is green. Eyes open, we get more red in the delta. You can see it particularly in the relative power here. It was easier to see in the earlier one, but I wanted to show you a variant on it. Here's seizure disorder. Delta and theta are usually really high in seizure disorder because the brain is under so much oxidative stress. See, a lot of the front of the brain is idling. This person's very brain foggy. We've got slowed alpha, and even the delta is slowing. So often you'll have a delta up at 30, 40, 50 microvolts in seizure disorder. Here's the rest of the map there. See, this person's depressed. A lot of hypocoherence because of that elevated delta in the delta frequency. Shows you how coherence often follows serious problems. This would be red if the brain was still holding its ground, but now that it's blue, it tells you that that delta's just overwhelmed the brain. Here's another seizure disorder. Notice we have the same pattern. Delta and theta elevated. A lot more perfusion issues in this one with frontal brain fog. Different case, but another map. And you can see the brain is trying to adapt in coherence and is holding its ground against that perfusion, but it may turn all blue in connectivity, and then we're really losing. Severe dysautonomia. Often have them come in. They've got delta deficits. Why? Because dysautonomia is about regulation of the brainstem and insular regulation. And so, if you remember, okay, they were saying earlier, key generators are in the insula and the brainstem. So when those generators are not working well, we're not going to have good integration in the brain at the most fundamental level, and we're going to have dysautonomia quite often. And sometimes people have features of that, but they don't really understand what it is, and the clinician doesn't understand why they have it. When you see low delta, even if it's from severe sleep deprivation, you'll see features of dysautonomia in people with severe chronic sleep deprivation. Here's Parkinson's. Again, here's another one. You can see that theta is elevated, delta is elevated, slowed alpha, and you can see this brain struggling to keep up with that delta and theta. It's losing on beta, low power, hypocoherent. This person is really cognitively negatively impacted. There's dementia, another map of dementia. Delta dominates in dementia, and you can see that a lot of slowing across the board there. That's really common in dementia. And finally, Oxycontin and Klonopin combined. Look what that does to the brain. That's an interesting impact. When you mix those two drugs together, affecting the neurotransmitter activity here. Okay, so that's my story on delta. And we're at the top of the hour. Hopefully you all found that interesting. If you had questions, write them down, send them to me and Rob and Martin, and we'll cover them next time on Lunch and Learn. We can even break open this PowerPoint if there were areas you were interested in that you wanted to review. We've recorded this, so Jason will be posting this on the New Mind YouTube channel. If it went a little fast for you, you'll be able to come back and go over it as many times as you want on New Mind YouTube. Rob, you were
perfect. I was just going to say excellent. I'm sorry I was late. I'm still having difficulties with computers and GoToMeeting, but nonetheless, great presentation, and we will see everybody on Friday.
Yeah.